The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded with the precision of a threat. It wasn't the first nasty note from the HOA, but this one was different. A final notice demanding that Mason tear down the small backyard shed he'd built to house his tools or face mounting fines and a lien on his home. He'd done everything by the book, or so he thought, yet one neighbor kept pushing, always pushing. The president's name was Karen, and she had a way of twisting community standards into chains. The shed wasn't the battle, it was the symbol. And by the time this ended, Karen's grip on the neighborhood would break, loudly and publicly. Mason had moved into the neatly planned community in early spring. It was the kind of neighborhood where lawns looked copy-pasted and hedges seemed standardized by ruler. He bought a fixer-upper at the end of a cul-de-sac and spent weekends turning splinters into something strong. He didn't join the HOA board, didn't really mingle, but he waved to dog walkers and kept to the rules he'd read and reread before buying. When he built the shed, painted a muted gray to match his house, he submitted photos, measurements, and a neat checklist of compliance, right down to the exact asphalt shingles. Approval never came, but silence did. He assumed it was fine, especially since 3 other homes along the back fence had nearly identical sheds visible from the street. He was the new guy, sure, but he wasn't the only one with outdoor storage. Then came the notes. First, a warning that his shed violated aesthetic uniformity. Then, a formal notice that it did not match neighborhood character. He kept pointing to the others, same size, same look, only to be told those were legacy exceptions. Karen, the board president, never seemed to speak to him directly. Instead, she sent letters, each one a degree colder, as if an inked voice could sharpen to a blade. Mason ignored the whispers at the mailbox cluster. He ignored the subtle glances at the tiny flag he placed inside his shed, a nod to his grandparents' old country that made him feel connected to his past. He ignored the flyers on the community app where Karen praised traditional values and keeping things standard. But when the final notice threatened him with a lien, he realized something uglier was operating behind the pretty hedges, and it wasn't about a shed. When Mason started comparing notes, his quiet suspicion hardened. He took photos of the 3 other backyard sheds, their paint shades, their shingles, their placement. He mapped every legacy exception he could spot and compared them to the neighborhood's meeting minutes, which he requested from the HOA in a polite email. He waited for the denial of access. Instead, Karen replied with an open records link and a reminder about decorum and community trust. He read through a year of agendas and offhand comments. Nothing obvious. Just the occasional phrase, neighborhood identity, consistent aesthetic, family-friendly feel, not too flashy. It was a language of conformity disguised as safety. In the community app, Mason noticed patterns in Karen's posts and the comments she allowed to linger. She praised a neighbor's pristine white pergola, but within hours of Mason sharing a photo of his shed renovation, just a coat of sealant and some pebbled edging, his post disappeared. He posted again, deleted again. Someone messaged him privately, a neighbor named Raj, to say he'd had a similar experience months back after installing colorful tiles on his front porch. The board had called it gaudy. Another neighbor, Danica, had been told to remove a set of handmade garden lanterns that gave off the wrong vibe. Meanwhile, a house 2 streets over kept a yacht trailer in plain view for weeks with no consequence. Mason didn't want to assume the worst, but the worst kept presenting itself. He walked the neighborhood at dusk, counting violations that existed in plain sight. Sheds, fountains, oversized planters, banners for hobby clubs. He compiled them into a spreadsheet with photos and dates. The picture that emerged was unmistakable. Enforcement was selective. Certain families, people who didn't quite fit the unspoken mold, got warnings, fines, or veiled lectures about standards, while others sailed by untouched. When a contractor came to help Mason insulate the shed, a patrol car rolled slowly past, circled, then returned. The officer said someone reported suspicious activity. The contractor was confused, pointing to his company logo and the work order. Nothing came of it, but Mason's stomach dropped. He remembered stories he'd heard but never lived, how a rule book could become a weapon when wielded by the wrong hands. He documented everything, including the patrol incident. Then he consulted a housing rights clinic downtown. The intake counselor didn't mince words. She explained that HOAs can't use aesthetics to justify discriminatory patterns of enforcement. Even if the rules are neutral on paper, how they are applied matters under the law. She encouraged him to file a request for architectural review records and enforcement histories, things most homeowners didn't realize were accessible. The records revealed that 2 of the approved sheds had been rubber-stamped in a single meeting with no discussion. Another homeowner received verbal approval, a practice not mentioned in the bylaws. A few doors down, a family had been fined for excessive cultural decor without any clear definition for the term. Mason's hands shook as he read the board emails available through a redacted log. The phrases were soft, but the intent seeped through. Certain elements didn't fit. The neighborhood should keep a traditional look. Modern accents are okay, but nothing too expressive. It wasn't a single smoking gun. It was a pattern dressed in politeness. Mason filed a formal complaint with the state's Civil Rights Division, citing selective enforcement, intimidation, and potential retaliation. He served the HOA with notice and requested a special meeting for members. Karen attempted to stall, sending a glossy newsletter about outside agitators and maintaining harmony. But the complaint triggered a requirement for the HOA to preserve records and to respond. As fines against Mason ticked upward, Karen posted a community reminder about unauthorized outbuildings and warned that continued violations could lead to liens and potential foreclosure. Neighbors began choosing sides. A few thanked Mason quietly for pushing back. Others parroted the newsletter. The tension felt like electricity trapped under glass, waiting for a spark. The special meeting drew more people than anyone expected. Folding chairs lined the clubhouse, and latecomers stood shoulder to shoulder by the window. Karen sat at the front, flanked by 2 board members and a stack of binders. She opened with a polished summary about uniformity, rules, and the importance of property values. She spoke as if this were merely a routine correction, not a confrontation with the soul of the neighborhood. When it was his turn, the victim Mason didn't raise his voice. He projected onto a screen the spreadsheet of observed violations with dates and photos, then layered in the approval histories he'd pried from the records. He overlaid the removals from the community app with the dates of his posts and similar posts by neighbors whose decor or structures felt different in subtle ways. He showed how some applications were processed in days, while others languished for months, with nitpicks about character and fit. Then came the clincher, a letter from the state's Civil Rights Division acknowledging his complaint and confirming an active investigation into possible discriminatory enforcement. The room shifted. The quiet murmur gelled into a collective inhale. A volunteer from the clinic stepped forward to explain, in steady language, what many didn't know. An HOA cannot hide behind neutral-sounding rules to target families it deems not our kind. Selective enforcement isn't just unfair. It's unlawful when it aligns with protected characteristics or proxies that stand in for them. Language, heritage symbols, accents in design that signify identity. The clinic volunteer did not accuse anyone by name. She didn't need to. The pattern spoke. Karen tried to reassert control. She framed it as a misunderstanding, as a necessary curation of community identity, as a burden of leadership. But a neighbor, an older man Mason had never met, stood and asked why his shed had been approved with a simple handshake, while Mason's triggered fines and threats. Another neighbor, voice trembling, described months of letters about her patio tiles and how she'd cried as she pried them up. Her words landed like stones on water, concentric circles of recognition expanding through the room. A vote was called to suspend enforcement actions pending investigation. It passed with a margin so wide that Karen's face flushed a brittle shade of resolve. The night didn't end with cheers. It ended with an uneasy, necessary silence. The investigation moved fast. Perhaps it was the thoroughness of Mason's documentation, or the community's new willingness to talk, or simple fatigue with a culture of quiet intimidation. Within weeks, the HOA agreed to a consent order rather than face a drawn-out public trial. They admitted no wrongdoing, but the terms spoke volumes. Mandatory training on fair housing and bias for all board members, a transparent written process for architectural approvals, an independent ombudsperson for complaints, and a review of past fines with refunds where selective enforcement could be shown. Karen resigned within days. The board appointed an interim president who sent an email unlike anything the neighborhood had seen. Plain, humble, and specific. The email laid out the changes coming, invited homeowners to a listening session, and promised sunlight where there had been shadows. Apologies began appearing in Mason's inbox, from neighbors who had stayed quiet, from people who'd assumed the rules were neutral, from a couple who realized the legacy exception on their pergola was just favoritism dressed in lazy tradition. Mason kept his shed. He added shelves and a pegboard, then did something he hadn't planned when he first built it. On Saturdays, he opened the doors. He invited neighbors to borrow tools and learn small repairs. He stocked a corner with free safety gear for teenagers working on school projects. He hung the little flag inside, not as provocation, but as a quiet reminder that everyone brings a story to the block, and no rulebook should erase it. Epic revenge didn't arrive as a dramatic takedown. It arrived as a system forced to bend toward fairness. The rules remained, but the way they lived in people's hands changed. Karen's departure was a lesson, not a victory lap. She'd used power to exclude, and the neighborhood learned what happened when that power met sunlight and a spine. If a shed can become a flashpoint, imagine what else can be twisted when no one's watching. When standards become code for shutting people out, who gets to feel at home? What would you do if your neighborhood's rulebook became a weapon in the wrong hands? Mason found his answer. Now the question is yours.